Margaret Johnson, a 68-year-old janitor at Hartwell Industries, pushed her cleaning cart down the long corridor, her movements slow but deliberate. For over 4 decades she had walked these halls, quietly maintaining the heartbeat of the company. Yet to most she was invisible, a ghost that materialized only when a mess needed tending. Little did Margaret know her life was about to change dramatically. What unexpected confrontation would shatter the routine of Margaret's day and expose the dark underbelly of corporate culture? And how could one woman's humiliation become the catalyst for a corporate revolution? Before we dive into this inspiring story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this heartwarming tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. As Margaret made her way towards the executive wing, her thoughts drifted to her grandchildren. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon her shoulders, a burden she never expected to bear at this stage of life. The loss of her daughter 2 years prior had left a void in her heart and 3 young mouths to feed. Every ache in her joints, every twinge in her back was a reminder of why she couldn't retire, why she pushed through each day despite her doctor's warnings. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," a soft voice called out, breaking through her reverie. Margaret looked up to see James Anderson, a young accountant, smiling at her. Unlike most employees who barely registered her presence, James always took the time to acknowledge her. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she replied, her voice warm despite her weariness. "How are you today?" "I'm well, thank you. And yourself? How are the grandkids?" A rare smile graced Margaret's features, momentarily lifting the veil of exhaustion. "They're growing like weeds, keeping me on my toes, that's for sure." James nodded, his eyes reflecting genuine interest. "I'm sure they appreciate everything you do for them. You're an inspiration, Mrs. Johnson." Before Margaret could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. "Anderson, don't you have work to do instead of wasting time with the help?" Richard Blackwell, the department manager, strode towards them, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. His lips were curled in a sneer, eyes cold as they swept over Margaret before settling on James. James straightened, his friendly demeanor replaced by a mask of professional detachment. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. I was just heading to my desk." As James hurried away, Richard turned his attention to Margaret. "And you, make sure you actually clean properly today. I'm tired of seeing dust in the corners." Margaret lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell, I'll do my best." Richard scoffed and walked away, leaving Margaret alone in the hallway once more. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the familiar sting of his words. This was far from the first time Richard had spoken to her this way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. As Margaret resumed her work, she couldn't help but reflect on how different things had become over the years. When she first started at Hartwell, the company had felt like a second home. Her colleagues had been friendly, and management had appreciated her dedication. But as the old guard retired and new faces took their place, the atmosphere had shifted. Richard Blackwell represented everything that had changed. He had climbed the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency, stepping on anyone he deemed beneath him. To Richard, Margaret was nothing more than a nuisance, a reminder of what he considered the old way of doing things. Little did Margaret know, her quiet resilience in the face of Richard's cruelty had not gone unnoticed. James Anderson, the young accountant who had greeted her, had been watching the situation unfold for months. Each interaction between Margaret and Richard made his stomach churn with a mixture of anger and guilt. James had joined Hartwell Industries fresh out of college, eager to make his mark in the corporate world. He had quickly learned to keep his head down and avoid drawing attention to himself, especially from Richard Blackwell. The manager's reputation for belittling employees, particularly those from minority backgrounds, was well known throughout the office. As James settled into his cubicle, he couldn't shake the image of Margaret's resigned expression. He had witnessed Richard's behavior countless times, each incident chipping away at his resolve to stay silent. But the fear of losing his job, of jeopardizing his fledgling career, always held him back. "If only I had the courage to speak up," James thought, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. But what difference would it make? Richard's too well connected. He'd probably find a way to fire me instead. Across the office, Richard Blackwell sat in his corner office, a smug smile playing on his lips as he surveyed his domain. At 45, he had achieved what he considered the pinnacle of success: power over others. His insecurities, deeply rooted in a childhood of mediocrity, drove him to assert his dominance at every opportunity. Richard's eyes narrowed as he spotted Margaret through the glass walls of his office. The sight of her stooped figure, as she dutifully cleaned the baseboards, ignited a familiar spark of contempt within him. To Richard, Margaret represented everything he despised: the old guard, the working class, the minorities he believed were holding the company back. "Time to remind the old bat of her place," Richard muttered to himself, rising from his leather chair. As he strode towards the restrooms where Margaret was now working, Richard felt a surge of anticipation. These moments, where he could exert his authority without consequence, were what he lived for. Little did he know this particular confrontation would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Margaret was on her knees scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the bathroom floor when she heard the door swing open. The sharp tap of expensive shoes on tile made her heart sink. She didn't need to look up to know who had entered. "Well, well, well," Richard's voice dripped with disdain. "If it isn't our resident fossil. Tell me, Johnson, do you actually clean anything, or do you just shuffle around pretending to work?" Margaret slowly rose to her feet, her joints protesting the movement. She kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the mop in her hands. "I'm doing my best, Mr. Blackwell," she said softly. Richard scoffed, taking a step closer. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the harsh scent of cleaning products, creating a nauseating combination. "Your best? Is that what you call this pitiful excuse for work? I've seen cleaner gas station bathrooms." His words cut deep, each syllable a pointed reminder of her perceived worthlessness in his eyes. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the mop handle tighter, using it as an anchor against the storm of Richard's tirade. "You know, Johnson, I've been wondering," Richard continued, his tone mockingly conversational. "How does it feel to be so obsolete? I mean, let's face it, you're well past your expiration date. The only reason you're still here is because no one else wants to do this menial job." Margaret's breath caught in her throat, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had endured Richard's verbal abuse before, but never with such viciousness. Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, to chip away at her already fragile self-esteem. I've been with the company for over 40 years, Mr. Blackwell," Margaret managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I take pride in my work." Richard laughed, the sound echoing harshly off the tiled walls. "Pride? In what? Pushing a mop around? Face it, Johnson, you're nothing but a relic. A bygone era that should have been phased out long ago. You're lucky we even keep you around, though God knows why. It's not like you can keep up with the job anymore." As Richard's verbal assault continued, neither of them noticed the slight movement behind one of the stall doors. James Anderson, who had entered the restroom just moments before Richard, sat frozen on the toilet seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come in to escape the stress of his workday for a few moments, never expecting to become an unwilling witness to such cruelty. Through the gap in the stall door, James could see Margaret's hunched figure, her shoulders shaking slightly as she absorbed Richard's abuse. He watched in horror as Richard stepped even closer, invading Margaret's personal space. "You know what your problem is, Johnson?" Richard sneered, his face inches from Margaret's. "You just don't know when to quit. You're too stupid or too stubborn to realize that you're not wanted here. Your kind doesn't belong in a modern workplace like this." The racial undertones in Richard's statement were unmistakable, and James felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He wanted to burst out of the stall, to confront Richard and defend Margaret, but fear kept him rooted to the spot. His mind raced with potential consequences: losing his job, being blacklisted in the industry, unable to support his family. Margaret, her voice trembling, tried one last time to stand her ground. Mr. Blackwell, I've always done my job to the best of my ability. I've never given anyone cause to complain about my work. Richard's eyes flashed dangerously. Your ability. Let me tell you something about your ability, you old crow. Your best isn't good enough. It never was, and it never will be. You're a disgrace to this company, and every day I have to look at you is a reminder of how far we still have to go to weed out the dead weight. With that final barb, Richard turned on his heel and stormed out of the bathroom, leaving Margaret alone, or so she thought. As soon as the door slammed shut, Margaret's composure crumbled. She leaned against the wall, slid slowly down to the floor, and began to sob quietly. James, still hidden in the stall, felt his heart breaking. The sound of Margaret's muffled cries echoed in the small space, each sob a damning indictment of his own cowardice. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that she didn't deserve such treatment, but the fear of discovery kept him silent. After what seemed like an eternity, Margaret's sobs subsided. James heard the rustle of movement, the squeak of the mop bucket's wheels, and then the soft click of the bathroom door as Margaret left. Only then did he emerge from his hiding place, his face pale and hands shaking. As he stared at his reflection in the mirror, James hardly recognized himself. The person looking back at him seemed smaller somehow, diminished by his failure to act. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the guilt that clung to him like a second skin. "I should have said something," he whispered to his reflection. "I should have stood up to Richard. What kind of person am I?" But even as he berated himself, James knew that tomorrow would likely bring more of the same. He would see Margaret in the hallways, offer her a kind word or a smile, but ultimately do nothing to change her situation. The realization made him feel hollow inside. As James left the bathroom, he made a silent promise to himself to be kinder to Margaret, to show her through small gestures that not everyone in the company shared Richard's views. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was all he felt capable of doing. Little did James know this incident would be the first in a series of events that would test his moral fiber and ultimately force him to confront the consequences of his inaction. The stage was set for a dramatic upheaval at Hartwell Industries, one that would challenge the status quo and bring long-buried injustices to light. In the days that followed, James found himself hyper-aware of Margaret's presence in the office. He noticed the way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever Richard was nearby, how her once steady hands now trembled slightly as she went about her work. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his failure to intervene. James began to show Margaret small kindnesses whenever he could. He made sure to greet her warmly each morning, sometimes leaving a cup of coffee on her cart with a note of appreciation. He took care not to leave messes at his desk, and he even started encouraging his colleagues to do the same. "Hey guys," he said one day to his fellow accountants, "why don't we make an effort to keep our areas tidy? It'll make Mrs. Johnson's job a little easier." Some of his co-workers agreed readily, while others grumbled about it not being their responsibility. But James persisted, hoping that these small acts might somehow make up for his silence in the bathroom that day. Margaret noticed the change in James's behavior and the subtle shift in some of the other employees' attitudes. While it didn't erase the pain of Richard's constant belittlement, it did provide a small ray of hope in her otherwise difficult days. One evening, as Margaret was finishing up her shift, she found James waiting by her cart. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice low and kind, "I just wanted to say thank you for all you do around here. I know it's not always easy, but please know that your work is appreciated." Margaret's eyes welled up with tears, touched by the young man's words. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." As James watched Margaret leave that night, he felt a mixture of warmth and shame. While he was glad to have brightened her day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should be doing more. The memory of Richard's tirade in the bathroom still haunted him, a constant reminder of his cowardice. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwell continued his reign of terror unabated. If anything, his treatment of Margaret and other minority employees seemed to worsen. It was as if he sensed the small acts of kindness being shown to them and was determined to counteract it with increased cruelty. James wasn't the only one who noticed. A network of whispers began to form among the employees, sharing stories of Richard's abuses and discussing ways to support each other. But fear still kept most from taking any definitive action. Richard's influence in the company seemed untouchable, his position too secure to challenge openly. Weeks passed, and the tension in the office continued to build. Margaret, despite the small kindnesses shown to her by James and others, was struggling. The stress of Richard's constant harassment, combined with her physical exhaustion and worry for her grandchildren, was taking its toll. One particularly difficult morning, Margaret felt lightheaded as she pushed her cart down the hallway. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the sounds of the office too loud. She paused, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. James, walking by with a stack of reports, noticed her distress. "Mrs. Johnson," he asked, concern evident in his voice, "are you all right?" Margaret tried to smile to reassure him, but the room suddenly tilted. James watched in horror as her eyes rolled back and she collapsed to the floor. "Mrs. Johnson," James cried out, dropping his papers and rushing to her side. "Someone call an ambulance." The office erupted into chaos. Employees gathered around, some trying to help, others simply gawking. Richard Blackwell emerged from his office, his face a mask of annoyance rather than concern. "What's all this commotion?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd. When he saw Margaret on the floor, he scoffed. "Oh, for heaven's sake, can't she even manage to stay on her feet? This is exactly why we need younger, more capable staff." James, kneeling beside Margaret and checking her pulse, looked up at Richard in disbelief. "Mr. Blackwell, she needs medical attention. This is serious." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, fine. Someone call an ambulance, but make sure they know she's not to come back until she's fit for work. We're not running a nursing home here." As the paramedics arrived and carefully lifted Margaret onto a stretcher, James felt a surge of anger, unlike anything he'd experienced before. The callousness of Richard's response, the utter lack of human decency, was more than he could bear. But even then, as he watched the ambulance drive away with Margaret inside, James remained silent. The fear of losing his job, of jeopardizing his future, still held him back. He returned to his desk, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, anger, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The incident with Margaret's collapse sent shockwaves through the office. Employees gathered in small groups, whispering about what had happened and speculating about Margaret's condition. Many expressed concern for her well-being, while others worried about their own job security in light of Richard's callous remarks. James found himself at the center of these discussions, having been the one to first notice Margaret's distress. His colleagues peppered him with questions, seeking details about what had transpired. "Is it true that Blackwell just stood there and didn't even try to help?" one of his co-workers asked during lunch. James nodded grimly. He seemed more concerned about the disruption to work than Mrs. Johnson's health. Another colleague shook her head in disgust. "That's Richard for you, always putting profit over people. Someone needs to do something about him." "But what can we do?" James asked, voicing the question that had been plaguing him for weeks. "He's got the board in his pocket. Anyone who speaks up is likely to find themselves out of a job." The group fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their collective helplessness hung heavy in the air. As days passed without any news of Margaret's condition, the initial shock of her collapse began to fade. Life at Hartwell Industries slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but for James, nothing felt normal anymore. Every time he passed Margaret's unused cleaning cart, tucked away in a corner of the supply closet, he felt a pang of guilt and remorse. James found himself unable to concentrate on his work. His mind kept replaying the scene in the bathroom, imagining all the ways he could have, should have, intervened. The what-ifs tormented him, robbing him of sleep and peace of mind. One evening, as James was working late to catch up on the backlog of reports he'd neglected, he overheard a conversation that would change everything. "Did you hear the news?" a hushed voice said from the break room. James recognized it as belonging to Sarah from Human Resources. "What news?" another voice replied. "Tom from Marketing. The board just announced it. We're getting a new CEO." James's ears perked up. He moved closer to the break room door, straining to hear more. "Really? What happened to old man Jennings?" "Retiring, apparently. The new guy's name is Harrison. Mr. Harrison, that's all I know for now." James's mind raced. A new CEO could mean big changes for the company. Could this be the opportunity they'd been waiting for? A chance to address the toxic culture that Richard Blackwell had fostered. But as quickly as hope had flared, doubt extinguished it. What if the new CEO was cut from the same cloth as Richard? What if things got even worse? James returned to his desk, his head spinning with possibilities. He wanted to believe that change was possible, that justice for Margaret and others like her could be achieved. But years of witnessing Richard's unchecked behavior had left him cynical. The next morning, the office was abuzz with speculation about the new CEO. Rumors flew back and forth. Some said Mr. Harrison was a hardline cost-cutter. Others claimed he was a progressive reformer. No one seemed to know for sure. Richard Blackwell strode into the office, his face a mask of barely contained anger. It was clear he wasn't pleased about the change in leadership. "All right, everyone," he barked. "I know you're all excited about the new CEO, but we have work to do. This company doesn't run on gossip. Back to your desks." As the days passed, anticipation built for Mr. Harrison's arrival. James found himself daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the catalyst for change. But he also knew that hope alone wasn't enough. If things were going to improve, someone would have to take a stand. The morning of Mr. Harrison's first day dawned bright and clear. James arrived at the office early, his stomach a knot of nervous energy. He half expected to see dramatic changes already in place, but everything looked the same as it always had. As he settled in at his desk, James overheard Richard talking loudly on his phone in his office. "I don't care what his background is," Richard was saying, his voice dripping with disdain. "This new CEO better not think he can come in here and change everything. I've worked too hard to build this department up to have some outsider tear it all down." James felt a chill run down his spine. It was clear that Richard had no intention of changing his ways, new CEO or not. The morning dragged on, with no sign of Mr. Harrison. By lunchtime, the initial excitement had given way to confusion and more speculation. Where was the new CEO? Why hadn't he addressed the staff? It was mid-afternoon when James, returning from a coffee run, almost bumped into a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was dressed casually in slacks and a polo shirt, a far cry from the suits and ties that were the norm in the office. "Oh, excuse me," James said, stepping aside. The man smiled warmly. "No problem at all. Say, you wouldn't happen to know where I could find Richard Blackwell's office, would you?" James nodded, pointing down the hallway. "Last door on the right, can't miss it. It's the biggest office on the floor." "Thanks," the man said, then hesitated. "I'm new here. Is there anything I should know about Mr. Blackwell before I meet him?" James felt a moment of panic. Should he warn this newcomer about Richard's behavior? But what if this man was a friend of Richard's, or worse, someone sent to test employee loyalty? "Mr. Blackwell is very focused on results," James said carefully. "He runs a tight ship." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, thank you for your help." "James," he supplied, "James Anderson." "Nice to meet you, James," the man said, shaking his hand. "I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other." As the stranger walked away, James couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just missed an important opportunity. He returned to his desk, berating himself for his cowardice once again. A few minutes later, a commotion from Richard's office drew everyone's attention. Richard's voice, raised in anger, could be clearly heard through the door. "Who do you think you are?" Richard was shouting. "Coming in here dressed like that, asking questions. This is my department, and I won't have some low-level diversity hire telling me how to run things." The entire office fell silent, all eyes fixed on Richard's door. James felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Richard could be abrasive, but this was beyond anything he'd witnessed before. Suddenly the door swung open, and the man James had met earlier stepped out. His face was calm, but there was a steely glint in his eyes. Behind him, Richard appeared, his face red with anger. "I believe," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned office, "that we need to have a company-wide meeting, now." It was at that moment that James realized who this man must be. His suspicion was confirmed when the stranger continued, "I'm Michael Harrison, your new CEO, and it seems we have some serious issues to address." The revelation sent shockwaves through the office. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, some unable to suppress smiles at Richard's obvious discomfort. Richard himself looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, all color draining from his face as the implications of his actions sank in. Mr. Harrison turned to address the room at large. "I'd like everyone to gather in the main conference room in 5 minutes. It's time we had an honest conversation about the culture of this company." As people hurried to comply, James felt a mix of emotions washing over him. Relief that Richard's behavior had finally been exposed, anxiety about what this meant for the future of the company, and a gnawing sense of guilt that he hadn't spoken up sooner. In the conference room, employees filed in quietly, an air of nervous anticipation filling the space. Richard skulked in last, positioning himself near the back of the room, as far from Mr. Harrison as possible. Mr. Harrison stood at the front, his casual attire a stark contrast to the sea of suits before him. He waited until everyone was settled before speaking. "I had planned to spend my first day observing, getting a feel for how this company operates," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "What I've seen in just a few short hours has made it clear that we have some serious work to do." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I believe in creating a workplace where every employee, regardless of their position or background, is treated with respect and dignity. What I witnessed today falls far short of that standard." Richard shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "I want to be clear," Mr. Harrison continued. "Discrimination, harassment, and abusive behavior of any kind will not be tolerated under my leadership. This company is about to undergo some significant changes, and I need every one of you to be on board." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked relieved, others worried. James found himself holding his breath, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "I know change can be difficult," Mr. Harrison acknowledged, "but I also know that it's necessary. Starting tomorrow, we'll be implementing new policies and procedures to ensure a safe and respectful work environment for all." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "I also want to extend an open invitation to anyone who has experienced or witnessed inappropriate behavior in this workplace. My door is always open, and I promise that your concerns will be heard and addressed." As the meeting concluded and people began to file out, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Mr. Harrison standing beside him. "James, isn't it?" Mr. Harrison said. "Could I have a word with you in private?" Nervously, James nodded and followed Mr. Harrison to a small meeting room. Once inside, Mr. Harrison's demeanor changed, becoming more approachable. "James, I couldn't help but notice your reaction when I was speaking about witnessing inappropriate behavior," he said gently. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" James hesitated, years of ingrained fear battling with his desire to do the right thing. He thought of Margaret, of all the times he'd stayed silent, and made his decision. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "There is, and I think it's long overdue." Over the next hour, James poured out everything he had seen and heard. He told Mr. Harrison about Richard's treatment of Margaret and other minority employees, about the incident in the bathroom, and about Margaret's collapse. As he spoke, he felt as if a great weight was lifting from his shoulders. Mr. Harrison listened intently, his expression grave. When James finished, he leaned back in his chair, processing everything he'd heard. "Thank you, James," he said finally. "I know that couldn't have been easy for you to share, but you've done the right thing, and you've given me the information I need to take action." James nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "What happens now?" he asked. Mr. Harrison's expression was resolute. Now we make things right, for Margaret, for you, and for everyone else who suffered under this toxic culture. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but I promise you, things are going to change around here. As James left the meeting room, he felt as if he was seeing the office with new eyes. The fear that had held him back for so long was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sense of hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Over the next few weeks, Hartwell Industries underwent a transformation. Mr. Harrison wasted no time in implementing new policies and procedures. Richard Blackwell was placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation, and a company-wide training program on diversity and inclusion was rolled out. But the most significant change, at least in James's eyes, came in the form of a visit to Margaret's hospital room. Mr. Harrison insisted on going personally, and he asked James to accompany him. As they entered the small, sterile room, James's heart clenched at the sight of Margaret looking so frail in the hospital bed. But when she saw them, her face lit up with a smile that seemed to erase years from her features. "Mrs. Johnson," Mr. Harrison said, taking a seat beside her bed, "I'm Michael Harrison, the new CEO of Hartwell Industries, and I believe you know James." Margaret nodded, her eyes curious. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Harrison. James, it's good to see you." Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mrs. Johnson, I've come here today to offer you an apology on behalf of the company. The way you've been treated is unacceptable, and I want you to know that things are going to change." He went on to outline the changes being implemented at the company, including a full review of all employees' working conditions and compensation. But it was his next words that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "We'd like to offer you an early retirement package," he said gently. "Full benefits, and a pension that will ensure you and your grandchildren are well taken care of. It's the least we can do to make amends for the way you've been treated." Margaret's hand trembled as she reached out to grasp Mr. Harrison's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." As they left the hospital, James felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he'd been seeking. "Thank you for doing that," he said to Mr. Harrison. "It means a lot, not just to Margaret, but to all of us who've worked with her over the years." Mr. Harrison nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start," he said. "We have a long way to go to truly change the culture of this company, but it's a step in the right direction." He turned to James, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Which reminds me, I have a proposition for you, James. How would you feel about heading up our new employee relations department? We need someone who understands the challenges we've faced and has the courage to speak up when things aren't right." James was stunned. "Me? But I didn't speak up for so long. I let things go on when I should have said something." "And yet when the moment came, you did speak up," Mr. Harrison pointed out. "That takes courage, James. The kind of courage we need to make real, lasting change." As James considered the offer, he realized that this was his chance to make a real difference, to ensure that what happened to Margaret would never happen to anyone else in the company. "I'd be honored," he said finally, his voice firm with newfound determination. Mr. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "Excellent. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I have a feeling we're going to make Hartwell Industries a place where everyone can thrive." As they walked back to the car, James felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came his way. In the months that followed, Hartwell Industries underwent a remarkable transformation. Under Mr. Harrison's leadership, and with James's dedication to improving employee relations, the company culture shifted dramatically. The toxic environment that had festered under Richard's management began to dissipate, replaced by an atmosphere of respect and inclusivity. Richard Blackwell, following a thorough investigation, was terminated from his position. The evidence against him, including James's testimony and accounts from numerous other employees, was overwhelming. His departure sent a clear message throughout the company that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. James threw himself into his new role with passion and commitment. He worked tirelessly to implement new policies, organize training sessions, and most importantly, to create an environment where employees felt safe to voice their concerns. The Employee Relations Department, under his guidance, became a vital part of the company's operations. One of James's first initiatives was to establish a mentorship program, pairing newer employees with experienced staff members. The program aimed to foster a sense of community within the company and provide support for those just starting their careers. To his surprise and delight, Margaret agreed to serve as an advisor to the program, sharing her wealth of experience and wisdom even in retirement. The changes at Hartwell Industries didn't go unnoticed in the business world. As word spread of the company's commitment to fairness and equality, Hartwell began to attract top talent from diverse backgrounds. The influx of new ideas and perspectives led to increased innovation and productivity, and the company's bottom line began to reflect these positive changes. But for James, the most rewarding aspect of the transformation was seeing the change in his colleagues. The fear and resignation that had once permeated the office was replaced by a sense of optimism and engagement. People smiled more, collaborated more freely, and seemed genuinely happy to come to work each day. One afternoon, about 6 months after Mr. Harrison had taken over as CEO, James received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was Margaret, looking healthier and happier than he had seen her in years. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, rising to greet her with a warm smile, "it's so good to see you. How are you doing?" Margaret's eyes twinkled as she took a seat. "I'm doing wonderfully, James. Or should I say Mr. Anderson, Head of Employee Relations." James chuckled, still not quite used to his new title. "Just James is fine, Mrs. Johnson. You've known me too long for formalities." "Well then, you must call me Margaret," she replied. She looked around his office, nodding approvingly. "You've done well for yourself, James, but more importantly, you've done well for others. I've been hearing about all the changes you've been making here." James felt a flush of pride at her words. "We still have a long way to go," he said modestly. "But we're making progress. How are you enjoying retirement?" Margaret's face lit up. "It's been a blessing, James. I can spend time with my grandchildren without worrying about making ends meet. And this mentorship program of yours, it's given me a new purpose. I never thought I'd be able to use my experiences here to help others, but that's exactly what's happening." As they chatted, James couldn't help but marvel at the turn of events. Here was Margaret, once so beaten down by the system, now thriving and helping to shape the future of the company. And he, who had once been too afraid to speak up, was now leading the charge for change. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mr. Harrison poked his head in, smiling when he saw Margaret. "I thought I recognized that voice," he said warmly. "Margaret, it's wonderful to see you. I hope you're not trying to lure James out of retirement to join you." Margaret laughed, a sound that still surprised James with its joy. "Not at all, Mr. Harrison. I was just telling James how impressed I am with all the changes around here. You've created something special." Mr. Harrison's expression softened. "We've all created this together," he said. "Every person who spoke up, every employee who embraced the changes, they're all part of this transformation, including you, Margaret. Your strength and dignity in the face of adversity inspired more people than you know." As the three of them continued to talk, James felt a profound sense of gratitude. He thought back to that day in the bathroom, when he had been too afraid to stand up for what was right. How different things might have been if he had found his courage earlier. But dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. What mattered was the present and the future they were all working to create. A future where every employee, regardless of their position or background, could feel valued and respected. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door and turned back to James. "You know," she said softly, "I always knew you had it in you to do great things, James. I'm just glad you finally realized it too." With those words, she left, leaving James with a lump in his throat and a renewed determination to continue the work they had started. That evening, as James packed up to go home, he took a moment to look out over the office. The space was the same as it had always been, with its rows of desks and humming computers. But the energy was different. People were lingering, chatting with colleagues, laughing. It wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a community. He thought about how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The work of creating a truly inclusive and respectful workplace was never done. There would always be new challenges to face, new biases to overcome. But as he watched his colleagues, saw the easy camaraderie and genuine smiles, James knew that they were on the right path. And he was committed to seeing it through, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. As he turned off the lights in his office, James made a silent promise to himself, to Margaret, and to every employee at Hartwell Industries. He promised to never again let fear silence him, to always stand up for what was right, and to work tirelessly to create a workplace where everyone could thrive. With a smile on his face and purpose in his heart, James left the office, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The story of Hartwell Industries. Transformation was far from over, but with each passing day it was becoming a tale of hope, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. And so, as the sun set on another day at Hartwell Industries, the company stood as a beacon of change in the corporate world. A living testament to the idea that with courage, compassion, and commitment, even the most entrenched systems can be transformed. The journey had been long and at times difficult, but for James, for Margaret, for Mr. Harrison, and for every employee who had found their voice along the way, it had been worth every step. They had not just changed a company, they had changed lives. And in doing so, they had written a new chapter in the ongoing story of workplace equality and human dignity. As news of Hartwell Industries' transformation spread, other companies began to take notice. Industry publications ran features on the dramatic turnaround, highlighting the positive impact on employee satisfaction and productivity. Mr. Harrison and James were invited to speak at conferences, sharing their experiences and insights on creating a truly inclusive workplace. The ripple effects of their actions extended far beyond the walls of Hartwell Industries. Other businesses, inspired by their example, began to reassess their own cultures and policies. The conversation around workplace discrimination and the importance of diversity was reignited across the corporate world. For James, this broader impact was both thrilling and humbling. He often found himself thinking back to that pivotal moment in the bathroom when he had remained silent in the face of injustice. How different things might have been if he had spoken up then. But he had learned that it's never too late to do the right thing, and that one person's courage can inspire others to find their own. As the months turned into years, Hartwell Industries continued to evolve and grow. The company became known not just for its products, but for its values. Top talent from diverse backgrounds sought out positions there, drawn by its reputation for fairness and opportunity. Margaret, though retired, remained a beloved figure in the Hartwell community. Her story became a part of the company's lore, a reminder of where they had come from and why their ongoing commitment to equality was so important. The mentorship program she advised flourished, helping to nurture the next generation of leaders who would carry forward the values of respect and inclusion. James, for his part, never forgot the lessons he had learned. Each day as he walked into his office, he made a point of greeting every employee he passed, from the newest intern to the most senior executive. He knew that in a truly inclusive workplace, everyone's contribution mattered. One day, about 5 years after the transformation had begun, James received an unexpected email. It was from a young woman named Aisha, who had just started as an intern in the marketing department. She asked if she could meet with him to discuss something important. Intrigued, James agreed to the meeting. When Aisha arrived at his office, he was struck by the mix of nervousness and determination in her eyes. "Mr. Anderson," she began, "I wanted to thank you personally for everything you've done here at Hartwell. You see, my grandmother used to work here." James leaned forward, a sense of recognition dawning. "Your grandmother?" Aisha nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, sir, Margaret Johnson was my grandmother." James felt a rush of emotion. Margaret, I had no idea she had a granddaughter working here now. She encouraged me to apply, Aisha explained. She told me all about the changes that happened here, about you and Mr. Harrison. She said that Hartwell had become the kind of place she'd always hoped it would be. James swallowed hard, touched by Margaret's words. Your grandmother was an incredible woman, Aisha. We owe her a great deal. Aisha smiled. She spoke highly of you too, Mr. Anderson. She said you were the one who finally stood up and told the truth about what was happening here. That's actually why I wanted to meet with you. She took a deep breath as if steeling herself. I've noticed some things in my department. Nothing as bad as what my grandmother went through, but there are some attitudes, some comments that make me uncomfortable. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, being new and all, but then I remembered my grandmother's story, and I knew I had to speak up. James listened intently as Aisha detailed her concerns. They weren't major infractions, but rather the kind of subtle biases and microaggressions that could, if left unchecked, create a hostile environment over time. When she finished, James nodded solemnly. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Aisha. You absolutely did the right thing by speaking up. We'll address these issues immediately. He paused, then added, You know, your grandmother would be proud of you. It takes courage to speak up, especially when you're just starting out. Aisha's eyes welled with tears. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. That means a lot to me. After Aisha left, James sat back in his chair, lost in thought. Margaret's legacy lived on, not just in the policies and programs they had implemented, but in the courage she had, inspired in her granddaughter. It was a powerful reminder that the work they were doing had real, lasting impact on people's lives. The next day, James called a meeting with the marketing department heads. Without naming Aisha, he addressed the concerns she had raised and outlined a plan for additional training and accountability measures. As he spoke, he could see the mix of reactions in the room. Some looked uncomfortable, others nodded in agreement, but all were listening intently. I know some of you might be thinking these are small issues, James said, that we're being too sensitive. But it's these small things that create the foundation of our culture. Every comment, every action, no matter how small, shapes the environment we work in. And we have a responsibility to ensure that environment is one of respect and inclusion for everyone. Over the next few weeks, James worked closely with the marketing department to implement the new measures. He made a point of checking in with Aisha regularly, ensuring she felt supported and heard. As word spread of how the situation had been handled, James noticed a subtle shift in the office atmosphere. People seemed more conscious of their words and actions, more willing to speak up when they saw or heard something inappropriate. It wasn't always easy. There were still challenges, still moments of tension and disagreement, but each time they faced these issues head-on, the company grew stronger, more unified in its commitment to equality and respect. One evening, as James was preparing to leave the office, he received a call from Mr. Harrison. James, Mr. Harrison said, his voice warm, I wanted to let you know that we've been recognized by the National Association for Workplace Equality. They want to present Hartwell with their annual award for outstanding commitment to diversity and inclusion. James felt a surge of pride. That's incredible news, sir. It's a testament to all the hard work everyone has put in. Indeed it is, Mr. Harrison agreed, and I'd like you to accept the award on behalf of the company, James. None of this would have been possible without your dedication and leadership. As James hung up the phone, he was overcome with emotion. He thought of Margaret, of Aisha, of all the employees who had found their voices over the past few years. He thought of the long journey they had all taken together, from a place of fear and silence to one of openness and respect. The award was a validation of their efforts, but James knew that the real reward was in the daily reality of Hartwell Industries. It was in the confident smile of an employee who felt valued, in the lively discussions where diverse viewpoints were welcomed and celebrated, in the knowledge that every person who walked through their doors had an equal opportunity to succeed. As he gathered his things to leave, James paused by the window, looking out over the city. The lights of other office buildings twinkled in the distance, and he wondered how many other companies were on their own journeys toward equality. How many other employees were finding the courage to speak up, to challenge the status quo, to create change. He hoped that Hartwell's story would inspire others, just as Margaret had inspired him, that their example would show other companies that creating a truly inclusive workplace wasn't just the right thing to do, it was also good for business. With a smile, James turned off his office light and headed home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready to face them, armed with the lessons of the past and hope for the future. As he walked through the parking lot, he remembered something Margaret had told him once, not long before she retired. "Change doesn't happen overnight, James," she had said. "It happens one day at a time, one person at a time. All we can do is keep moving forward, keep doing what's right, and trust that it makes a difference." Those words had stayed with him, guiding him through the difficult days and celebrating with him in the moments of triumph. And now, as Hartwell Industries stood on the brink of national recognition for their efforts, James knew that Margaret had been right. They had changed their company one day at a time, one person at a time, and in doing so, they had changed lives, including his own. As James drove home that night, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, grateful for the second chance he'd been given to do the right thing, grateful for leaders like Mr. Harrison, who had the vision and courage to drive real change, grateful for people like Margaret and Aisha, whose strength and dignity in the face of adversity had inspired so many others. But most of all, he was grateful for the opportunity to be part of something bigger than himself, to contribute to a movement that was slowly but surely changing the face of corporate America, to help create a world where everyone, regardless of their background or position, could come to work each day feeling valued, respected, and empowered to reach their full potential. As he pulled into his driveway, James made a mental note to call Margaret in the morning and share the news about the award. He knew she would be proud, not just of the recognition, but of how far they had come. The story of Hartwell Industries was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new battles to fight. But James was ready for them, because he knew now more than ever that one person really could make a difference, that speaking up, even when it was difficult, could set in motion a chain of events that could transform not just a company, but an entire industry. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, James Anderson, once a silent bystander, now a champion for change, felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that tomorrow and every day after, he would continue to stand up for what was right, to be the voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, to work tirelessly to create a world where stories like Margaret's would become a thing of the past. Because in the end, that's what true leadership was all about. Not titles or power, but the courage to do what's right, the compassion to care for others, and the commitment to creating a better world for everyone. And in that moment, James knew that he had found his true calling, not just as a successful executive, but as a catalyst for change, a champion for equality, and a beacon of hope for all those who dared to dream of a fairer, more inclusive world. The story of Hartwell Industries, of Margaret, of James, and of all those who had found their voices along the way, would continue to inspire others for years to come. It would serve as a reminder that no matter how entrenched injustice may seem, change is always possible. That with courage, perseverance, and a commitment to doing what's right, we can create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. And so, as a new day dawned at Hartwell Industries, the company stood as a shining example of what was possible when people came together with a shared vision of equality and respect. The journey had been long and at times difficult, but for everyone involved it had been worth every step. For in the end, they had not just changed a company, they had changed lives. And in doing so, they had written a new chapter in the ongoing story of human dignity and the pursuit of justice in the workplace. As the sun rose on another day at Hartwell Industries, the company stood ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their commitment to creating a better world, one day at a time, one person at a time. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put a lot of effort into creating these impactful narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.